Driving financial leadership through turbulent times. That's the topic of discussion for us here on this very, very special day today. Let me introduce our panelists for you. With me here, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairperson of the Planning Commission, Mr. Rajeev Talwar, Group ED of DLF, Mr. Sumant Sinha, Chairman and CEO of Renew Power, Mr. S Butola, Chairperson of the Indian Oil Corporation, Mr. Pramod Bhasin, Non-Executive Vice Chairman of Genpact, and Mr. PV Bhide, former Revenue Secretary. Thank you all for being with us here. Dr. Ahluwalia, let me start by asking you, when corporate leaders are sitting in boardrooms and drawing up their plans, they start the this financial year, thinking about a growth rate of 7.6%, something that they were told in the budget this year. We're going to end the year at 5.6 or 5.8%. You said we'd be lucky if we do 5.8%. What went wrong?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite clear that at the start of the year, people just didn't anticipate how bad the year was going to be, both globally and maybe in the emergence of domestic constraints. I think both are important. And from the global point of view, let's be clear, our CEOs were not faced only with a domestic downgrading of growth. I mean, there's been a global downgrading. If you look at what the IMF was saying when the budget said 7.5%, and compare that with what actually turned out, there's been a significant downturn. Should we have been anticipating? But I think most people recognize that when when a budget is made, it's usually made on the basis of assumptions sort of in January, although the budget is presented actually at the end of February. And you could argue at that time probably whether 7.5 is too high, should it be 7 or something. But I don't think it was that much. It was not a case of putting in a number that didn't make any sense at all. I mean, the fact is you've had a continuously. It doesn't make sense
now. 7.6 clearly doesn't make sense now when we're talking about 5.7.
No, clearly, but that's what the Finance Ministry itself, in its submission to Parliament, has said that it's going to be somewhere between, I forget now, 5.6 and 5.8 or something like that.
That's a revised estimate. So,
yeah.
So what we're really trying to understand is that are we underestimating the global risks, or are we failing to understand how our own economy works?
Well, as I said, I think we certainly, it's not a question of underestimating the global risk. I mean, the essence of risk is that you have upside and downside possibilities, and we ended up with a downside possibility. So that is inherent uncertainty. It's possible that we underestimated the nature of the domestic constraints. And that is why, if we had not underestimated the nature of the domestic constraints, we would just be doing business as usual. Now, the fact that they've notified a cabinet committee on investment, and I saw the notification just today,
right,
clearly a recognition that some of the will not happen unless some exceptional decision-making mechanisms are put in place. So our view now is that we need to do that, and it's quite obvious that earlier it perhaps wasn't felt sufficiently necessary. But you live and learn. The key issue is, are we going to be able to do now the kinds of things that will actually get the domestic economy moving? Now, my feeling is that, if the long-term growth rate that I talked about is somewhere around 7.2, something like that, then we are quite clearly below India's long-term growth potential.
Right.
So getting back to long-term growth potential just means fixing what's happening domestically. Now, obviously, I don't believe that the world is going to get worse next year than it is this year. It's not going to get better.
So the global risks aren't there, you're saying?
Well, the risks are always there, but what I'm saying is the mean outcome for next year is not going to be much worse than the mean outcome this year. It'll be worse in some, better in others. So by and large, we will have just as poor a global environment next year as we had this year, and hopefully we'll have a better management of the domestic constraints. So 5.8 will increase. Now,
all right,
how much it will increase, well, that's a matter that one can discuss.
Right, but we're glad that there's a recognition that there is a need to do things domestically, that the problems have been in many ways self-inflicted. Let me actually get Sumant Sinha to talk a little about the trust deficit between corporate India and the government. We've seen government bashing becoming the flavor of the season the last 2 years. We've seen enough and many corporate leaders standing up and telling the government to act. Do you believe what has happened in the last few months has helped bridge that trust deficit to an extent?
Well, Shweta, I think the issue really was that if you look at the first few years of UPA 2, I think, after the stimulus that was in response to the global financial crisis in 2008, the stimulus was never really withdrawn at the right time. And so therefore, every year we would target a fiscal deficit of 4 to 5% and end up at close to 6%. Interest rates stayed high. The entire investment environment somehow did not really move in the right direction. And in 2 or 3 large sectors, particularly, let's say, telecom and coal, we ran into all sorts of other problems. And because that happened, that in a way led to a situation where the investment cycle just faltered by the wayside. And interest rates, being very high, did not really help the situation in that respect. And so what happened is that over a period of those 2-3 years, corporates got more and more stressed as their projects did not take off. And therefore, their ability to make new investments just started to become a lot weaker. And, I guess at that time, there were not really very strong signals coming out of the government that, in fact, some strong action was going to be taken. And so when that happened year after year, and really almost for 3.5 years, that same situation persisted. And that's really when I think a lot of corporates got up and started saying, a lot of new voices started emerging, saying that the government needs to do more. And I think, as you alluded to the fact that in the last literally 4 or 5 months, with in a way a change of guard at the finance ministry, some strong steps have been taken. I would say that to some extent that trust deficit certainly is getting bridged. Because, Dr. Ahluwalia spoke about a lot of the things that have to be done.
Right.
Earlier they were not getting done. In the last 4 months, we have seen that they are beginning to get done. But just like it took many, many years for the India growth story to manifest itself and unfurl itself and for us to get to the $30-40 billion of FDI and so on, it's going to be a bit of time, I think, before that trust sort of deficit goes away and we start having better confidence in the economy. That also has to correspond with the fact that now a lot of corporates are in difficulty in terms of their investment situations. And that has to also, in a way, redress itself. So not only does sentiment need to come back, but the ability of corporates to reinvest also needs to come back. And I think unless that happens, we're not going to see, I think, at least the investment cycle take off very significantly. Now, the only one point I would like to add is the fact that this year's budget is, to my mind, going to be a critical one because the government can go either of 2 ways. It can go in the populist direction, which leading up to the elections is possible, or it can go in the direction that we're on right now. And all the steps that Dr. Ahluwalia spoke about can continue to be taken. And I think if that happens, you'll probably start seeing a slightly stronger sense of confidence begin to return. It's going to take time, but it'll begin to happen. And if that happens, I think we can end the year with looking at a higher growth, sort of exit growth rates, as it were, than entry growth rates that we're going to be seeing at the beginning of the year. So I think that is critical. So I think a lot really depends upon what happens in the budget of this year. And keep in mind that in the budget of last year, we had pinned similar hopes, and we were all disappointed.
Right. India's #1 news app just got even better. Download NDTV's new app. Fully optimized for retina display. Full screen view. Faster response time. And Sudoku. NDTV's new iPad app. Download now.